Richard Nixon won one of the biggest landslides in US history. So, what is the most powerful man in America suddenly becomes the first president to resign? All this and much more you will discover in this video. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Thank you.
We have heard just a couple of minutes ago that President Nixon may have died.
So help you God.
So help me God.
First, let's break down why Nixon won the election in such a shocking landslide. Was it truly the love of the American people, or simply a perfect storm of circumstances? The late 60s in America were marked by protests, racial division, chaos, and growing anti-war movements. But Nixon was seen as a man who could take the nation's problem in his strong grip. His strongest support came from ordinary Americans, farmers, the working class, and suburban families. And without hesitation, he leaned into that support, presenting himself as a defender of their interests, or at least that is what he claimed. It's also important to note his position on Vietnam. Nixon wanted to reduce America's presence there, but in a way that wouldn't look like a complete defeat.
I have initiated a plan which will end this war in a way that will bring us closer to that great goal, to which Woodrow Wilson and every American president in our history has been dedicated, the goal of a just and lasting peace. As president, I hold the responsibility for choosing the best path to that goal and then leading the nation along it.
His opponent in this political shutdown was George McGovern, a man many Americans saw as too radical. His campaign was plagued with problems, and frankly, he failed to inspire much confidence among the public. Against this backdrop, Nixon appeared to be the safe choice for all America. So, when the 1972 election arrived, Nixon was nearly unstoppable. He won 49 out of all 50 states. What was happening in the country right after his re-election? America was facing major problems: war, inflation, protests, and deep political division. Let's take a closer look at the situation in Vietnam between 1969 and 1973, because, in my opinion, Nixon showed himself to be a strong geopolitical leader by bringing the war to an end. By 1969, when Americans had grown tired of the war, the question was no longer whether to leave. It was only this: how could the United States get out without looking defeated? The first thing Nixon did was increase pressure on the battlefield, making full use of America's modern air power. At the same time, he hoped to combine that military pressure with more favorable negotiation terms in the newly launched peace talks, while also applying diplomatic pressure on the Soviet Union, hoping Moscow would encourage its North Vietnamese allies to enter serious negotiations. After realizing that this strategy wasn't producing results, Nixon began to withdraw American troops under the banner of redeployment. From that point on, the withdrawal of US forces continued without stopping, but by 1972, North Vietnam launched another major offensive against the South, once again hoping to gain an advantage on the battlefield before returning to negotiations. And obviously, Nixon could accept the prospect of defeat, so he once again committed massive military force. For the first time, this action pushed both sides towards serious negotiations. And once again, the negotiations failed to achieve anything. As you have probably realized by now, it seems like nothing and no one could stop the conflict anymore, but Nixon saw it differently. He ordered a new wave of strikes against North Vietnam, what became known as the Christmas bombings. Through these actions, along with many other factors, both sides ultimately managed to reach and sign a peace agreement. But honestly, for many Americans, this didn't feel like a great triumph. At most, it brought a sense of relief, and a lot of people were thinking, at least our boys are coming home. People started asking questions that seemed obvious to them. Was the government telling the truth? Could official statements still be trusted? And those questions ended up changing America's political culture in a major way. At the same time, in 1973, the United States was hit by a major energy crisis that made everyday life much harder for ordinary Americans and limited how freely they could travel. It all began with the oil embargo of October 17, when Arab countries, along with Egypt, announced that they would stop supplying oil to nations supporting Israel. Sounds a little familiar to modern times, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, our expectations for this winter have now been sharply altered by the recent conflict in the Middle East. Because of that war, most of the Middle Eastern oil producers have reduced overall production and cut off their shipments of oil to the United States.
But we won't go deep into the Middle East situation. What matters for us is how Americans felt and how it changed their lives. And believe me, the impact was huge. Gas prices skyrocketed to levels people weren't used to, making it difficult for Americans to keep driving the large, fuel-hungry cars as freely as before. As a result, during this period, many Americans started switching to smaller and more fuel-efficient Japanese cars. But was this really Nixon's fault? Opinions differ. In my view, there wasn't much he could have done to stop it, because this was a global crisis, not a problem unique to the United States. And on top of that, because of his weakening political position during Watergate, he didn't have much room to respond effectively. So what exactly was Watergate? And why did everyone know about it at the time? According to reports from that era, around 80% of Americans watched those same infamous hearings and recordings. Watergate itself was simply a complex in Washington, D.C., which included the headquarters of the Democratic Party. Many Americans assumed it was some kind of government building. In reality, it wasn't. Besides the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, where political strategists, administrators, and campaign staff worked, the complex also housed other offices, law firms, private businesses, the large Watergate Hotel, and countless luxury apartments where some of Washington's elite lived. Just imagine being an ordinary resident in that building, and suddenly hearing the entire world talking about the place where you live. So, what exactly happened in this building? 5 men broke into the headquarters of the Democratic Party. Among them was James McCord, and he was no ordinary burglar. He had a very serious background. Before the break-in, McCord had spent years working for the CIA, focusing on security operations. But during Nixon's campaign, he was working for an organization called the CRP, officially the Committee to Re-elect the President, though critics jokingly called it creep. But the most interesting part began when we ask, what exactly was he doing at Watergate? Why was he among the men who broke in? According to investigators, they were installing listening devices, photographing documents, and trying to gather political intelligence on Nixon's opponents. But there is another version of the story. Some believe this wasn't even the first visit to the headquarters. According to that theory, they had already been there once before, and returned because there were problems with the wiretapes. You are probably wondering, how did such highly trained operatives carrying out a mission that could put a sitting president at risk ended up getting caught? When I first heard the story, I honestly thought it sounded like something straight out of a Hollywood movie or something. At around 1 or 2 in the morning, our burglars were already inside the Democratic headquarters. They were dressed in the suits and carried gloves, electronic equipment, cameras, and wiretapping devices. The critical mistake happened at exactly 1:47 a.m. when a security guard named Frank Wills noticed something strange. A piece of tape placed over a door latch in the underground parking garage prevented the door from locking automatically. At first, Wills assumed it had been left there by the maintenance staff, so he simply removed the tape and continued his patrol without raising any alarm. But when he returned about 15 minutes later, he saw the exact same tape placed on the exact same door. That's when he realized something was seriously wrong. He immediately called the police, who arrived looking almost like hippies themselves. Long hair, plain clothes, and an unmarked car. At around 2:30 a.m., officers entered the building and began checking each floor, slowly making their way towards the DNS offices. The police noticed open doors, strange noises, and movement inside. When they entered, they found several men hiding behind desks, wearing gloves and carrying wiretapping equipment. But the most important moment came when one of the arrested men was identified as former CIA officer James McCord. And just like that, one small mistake, a strip of tape on a door, triggered one of the biggest political explosions in American history. Because if the security guard had never noticed it, and never called the police, The history of the United States might have turned out very differently. All of this happened just 5 months before the US presidential election, the very election that, as we know, Nixon went on to win in a landslide. But why? Why did so many people initially overlook such a serious scandal? The answer is actually quite simple. During the summer and fall of 1972, no matter how hard journalists tried to dig deeper, they just couldn't directly connect Nixon himself to the break-in. There were suspicions, questions, and growing concerns, but there was still no clear evidence tying the president to the operation. As a result, for many voters, Watergate seemed like a strange incident rather than a scandal that reached all the way to the White House. Nixon himself rarely addressed the incident directly. Instead, he tried to minimize its significance, portraying it as nothing more than a political attack from his opponents. His strategy was simple: avoid giving the story more attention than necessary. But the major turning point came in March 1973, when James McCord wrote a letter to the judge. James never directly accused Nixon in that letter. However, he claims that the defendants had been subjected to political pressure to stay silent, avoid revealing the full truth, and take the blame themselves. He also suggested that the court had not been given the complete story of what happened that night at Watergate. In other words, he was implying that there were higher-ranking individuals involved, whose names had not yet been revealed. Up to that point, the official narrative had been fairly simple. A few men carried out a failed break-in. They got caught. End of story. But after McCord's letter, a new question emerged. What if this is only the tip of the iceberg? The judge took the letter extremely seriously, because he had already begun to suspect that the case was far bigger than anyone had initially imagined. By May of that same year, the televised hearings began. And this was a huge moment, because for the first time, the entire nation could watch the investigation unfold in real time. Today, we are used to seeing everything instantly through the internet, but back then, people consumed information very differently. Seeing these events broadcast on television gave them a completely new level of impact. Then, in June, the drama intensified, with the involvement of John Dean, one of the Nixon's former closest legal advisors. After McCord's letter, Dean began cooperating with investigators, largely because he feared for his own future. And that's why historians often point to June 25, 1973, as one of the most important dates in the entire Watergate story. Dean testified that after the break-in, people with Nixon's circle had tried to cover up the facts, influence witnesses, and arrange hush money payments to keep people silent. But his most explosive accusation was directed on Nixon himself. According to Dean, he had personally discussed the cover-up with the president. He described meetings inside the White House and argued that Nixon was not merely a bystander watching events unfold. During one of those conversations, Dean repeatedly told Nixon a phrase that would become legendary: "There's a cancer growing on the presidency." For the American public, this was a shock. Up until then, journalists had only suspected that the scandal reached the White House. Now those claims were coming directly from a former presidential advisor. Because there were no recordings available at the time, Nixon's response was straightforward. He denied Dean's version of events. And despite the growing scandal, he still believed he could survive it. Then 3 weeks later, Washington learned something that changed everything. The White House had been secretly recording conversations all along. It's also important to talk about Alexander Butterfield and the role he played in the story. Butterfield was a senior aide in the president's office. He managed Nixon's schedule and had access to the inner workings of the White House. He had absolutely no intention of exposing the president. But during testimony, he was asked a simple question: is there a system that records the president's conversations? His answer was short: yes. And with that single word, he effectively blew a hole in Nixon's defense. The recording system had originally been installed largely for historical archives and the president's own reference, but it quickly became a massive problem. For nearly a year, investigators demanded access to the tapes. Nixon repeatedly refused, citing executive privilege and arguing that the president has the right to confidential conversations. But many Americans began asking an obvious question: if you are innocent, then What are you hiding? And even when Nixon finally handed over the tapes, another problem emerged. There was an unexplained gap of about 18.5 minutes on one of the recordings. To many people, it looked as if the most important part had somehow disappeared. The climax of the entire story came with what became known as the smoking gun tapes. This was a recording of a conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, Haldeman. The tape became public in August 1974 and destroyed Nixon's central defense, the claim that he had not interfered with the investigation. On the recording, Nixon and Haldeman discussed the fact that the FBI investigation was beginning to move in a dangerous direction. The FBI had started tracing money connected to the Watergate burglars, and the financial trail could potentially lead back to people involved in Nixon's campaign.
On the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control it, and their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank, sources, the banker stuff, and it goes some directions we don't want it to go.
So Haldeman proposed a plan. Use the CIA to pressure the FBI into slowing down the investigation. The idea was to tell the FBI that digging any deeper might interfere with national security matters or sensitive CIA operations.
The way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this. This is business here. We don't want you going any further on that.
At that point, Nixon lost support even within his own party. When Republican leaders from Congress came to the White House, they essentially delivered a blunt message. There are no longer enough votes in the Senate to save you. And in that moment, Nixon realized the game was over. That same night, the White House discussed two possible paths forward. Option 1. Keep fighting. But that would almost certainly lead to impeachment and a likely conviction in the Senate. Option 2. Resign voluntarily. They chose the second option. And so Nixon delivered the speech that would become one of the most famous presidential addresses in American history. Take a listen.
From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary to back the very difficult decisions and carry out the duties of this office in the way the interests of the nation will require. I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
After Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford became the President of the United States. Soon afterward, he made one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency. He granted Nixon a full pardon. That meant Nixon could no longer be federally prosecuted for any potential crimes related to Watergate. And that brings us to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, let me know in the comments who would you like me to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.